Okay, welcome. I'm going to get started. It is Tuesday, October 4th, and you're joining us for the Data Assessment and Accountability Network. It's been a while. I think we saw some of you over the summers at the Wednesdays at 1, but it was, a relatively small turnout. So it's good to see the larger group coming together. It's an interesting year with assessment and accountability, as always. And we have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to jump right in. First of all, just a quick overview of the agenda. We're going to do introductions here in a minute, and then we're going to talk a little bit about our DAAN communication strategies and our new newsletter, the DAAN Digest, and our purpose with that. Then we'll give you some accountability updates, talking about the public release of the CAASPP, the ELPAC, and the expected timeline for the release of the dashboard. Also talk about some really important State Board of Education updates that took place just last week. And then we're going to look at just a review. This is an old State Board, but it's really relevant for the dashboard, which is the revised CSI and ATSI criteria. Just it's easy to get those things confused with DA, so I thought we'd revisit that. Also talking briefly about the dashboard toolkit that's available, and then an upcoming training that we have, and we'll share a link for that. Then we'll switch over to assessment, and there is no shortage of assessment updates. As always, there'll also some State Board updates for our assessment team, some updates from our RAN, which is our statewide regional assessment network, then some specific CAASPP and ELPAC updates. And then if time allows, we'll have a breakout discussion. And then finally, we're going to have our success agent here, Marcus Pettencourt, is going to join us at the end for some technical questions, updates on what ETS is seeing, and any questions and answers you may have. So, quick introduction of us. I'm Evan Bartelheim. I'm the Project Director for Accountability and Data Literacy, and I'm joined by my colleague Hillary Weissman, who's also in my unit, Stephen Bartlett, who's in the Assessment Unit, Stephanie Fortunato.
Good morning, everyone.
And Margarita Sandoval.
Morning.
I need to do a better job with my, my Hollywood Squares introductions here. It's been a while, all right? I'm rusty. I apologize, but yeah, I got to give you a break to make that pithy little comment at your Paul Lynde cut quote. Am I aging myself with Paul Lynde reference? I forget. Anybody who's nodding, I know, is at least as old as I am. But let's hear a bit about you. We have a lot of new faces this year, and we've met a lot of you this summer at the CAASPP or ELPAC new coordinator training. But we want this to be a friendly place. And so I think everybody can relate to this. So in the chat, if you will, drop in what you find to be the scariest part of your job as an assessment or accountability professional, maybe somebody who deals with data. What's the scariest part of your job? We can see we're all scared of something, right? David, data is a 4-letter word. Yes, it is, but we can't be afraid of it, right? David is the guy who makes data really friendly. Edwin, CalPads. Oh my gosh, yes, this year has to be a tough one when you hear CalPads. I was going to admit, I'm actually a little bit intimidated of getting in front of the CalPads network because it's always lately, it's just been one trouble after another. Missing deadlines. Yes, a lot of missing deadlines. Lack of people. I see Lisa working without an SIS lead on campus. Yeah, we're definitely have some staffing issues and a lot of turnover in some key roles. Errors, uploading CSV files, sure. Stephen and Stephanie, Hillary, what are you most afraid of in your job?
Oh my gosh, it's like a constant change, right? I feel like right when I get used to one thing, it's like, oh, and it shifts right away. It's just like this constant momentum of having to like shift to something new.
To not knowing what you may not know or what you can't anticipate, trying to predict, trying to understand.
Yeah, and this is, I think that was my point here, kind of warming up. I see Miguel says, new to my assignment, not knowing what I need to know. Miguel, you're in a good company here. I think things have changed so rapidly in the last few years, and I think even those of us who've been in this field for a while are still finding that it's changing. We're all newbies. Every year there's something new thrown at you, or there's a new complex problem to solve. So that part is, you just cannot know it all. And if you think you do, then you're likely to get likely to get reminded by the universe that you can't. So anyway, well, thank you for indulging me there. I hope your month isn't too scary. And hopefully this rest of this year isn't too scary. I'm glad that nobody said I'm terrified of the dashboard coming out, because that may be something that is a little intimidating this year. So just some housekeeping before we get started. Our purpose here really for the DAAN, for our network meeting, is to provide LEAs with the latest information in those areas of data assessment and accountability, including CalPADS information that's relevant to your work. The information we've gathered here is current as of late yesterday. Actually, technically, we were making changes as of this morning. So as of 7:30 this morning, that's how current the information is. But of course, it's subject to change, and it always will be. For the purpose of our meeting, it's really helpful if you could use the chat to submit your comments, and we will make sure that we can either address them in real time, or we can address them in our follow-up Q&A, which we're going to put in our DAAN digest. We do record the meeting, and it's saved. The recording will be posted on the DAAN Canvas page on the agenda after the fact. So if you have to leave for any reason, or if there's something you want to reference later, you can always look back for all the recordings. We always keep those recordings. So quickly, what we have today in our Canvas, let me just switch over real quick so we can take a look at that. So in Canvas, we have the presentation, and we have a number of resources, particularly our assessment unit has a number of resources that they've included for your reference today. We also have a series of workshops that are promoted. These are all LACOE workshops that are upcoming, including, I just dropped this last one in. A reminder, we had this effective grading practices, grading actions workshop. We had the first one. It was great stuff. And I know some of you were there. There's 3 more, and they're standalone. So if you weren't able to join us for the first one, you can join us for the remaining 3, and you can still get a lot out of it. And what else? Oh, so let me just talk real briefly about our goal here. We're always trying to improve our communication. And I think that one of the things that's really hard to do in your roles is this, sift through all the emails you get. And of course, you get a lot. If you're on as many listservs as we are, you probably get 5 emails a day that are critical. So what we've decided to do with our own DAAN emails is try to keep them consistent and send them out every other week. And we're going to use the DAAN emails to kind of curate and annotate the things that we see. So many of these you'll see in other places, but trying to put them in context for you, and to highlight those things that we don't want you to miss. So our goal really is to make sure that the things that we know you can't miss in your role, the most critical items, make it to your attention. So if you read nothing else, read our bi-weekly DAAN digest. How's that for a plug? But yeah, we're largely looking to the CDE, the State Board of Education, ETS, and any other source that we come across. We're going to include descriptions and links to our professional development opportunities that you may find helpful, articles of interest that we think will help benefit you professionally. And we save all these DAAN digests. So if you happen to miss one, or if you're thinking, gosh, I could have sworn I saw that at some point, we do keep them all posted on the DAAN campus page. There's a communication archive section that you can go back, and all the DAAN digests will be posted there by Margarita. And then finally on this, we've had quite a few of you post, but really the way we hope to improve our communications, and the way we hope to help define what our presentations outside of DAAN are, for instance, Wednesdays at 1, help us by filling out this survey, and we get a better idea of your needs, your priority areas, and areas that you would like to grow in, so we can tailor our professional development, tailor our communication, so we make sure that you get the information that you need. And we hope to provide an updated DAAN list for the members of this group. I don't want it to get out on the internet so you get caught up in spam, but I know sometimes as you meet people here, you're like, wow, I really have a question specific to Power School, and who knows that information? Well, it's really helpful if you can look at a list that has the districts that are similar to yours, who may be using the same SIS, or maybe using the same data warehouse or things like that. So that's really the value of DAAN. Since we haven't been meeting in person for a while, it's easy to lose touch with the folks who are usually sitting at our table. So we're going to try to improve that as well. So I'm going to jump into the accountability updates. This has been a big one lately, is the release of data and some confusion. So this memo went out from the CDE on the 23rd of September, and it was related to the CAASPP and LPAC embargo preview and the CAASPP LPAC website. And so in this, they noted that this information that was being released, there's a lot of pressure on the state to get their data out there as quickly as possible. The state, by contrast, wants to make sure that assessment data isn't overemphasized. That's the whole point of the dashboard. It's multiple measures, different ways of looking at LEAs to ensure that they get a holistic view. But there was a lot of pressure since the data was out there, and I'm sure you read some of the articles. A lot of districts were getting hit with Public Records Act requests to release the data. So they said, okay, we'll publicly release the data. Now, until that data is publicly released, you as an LEA, you have the freedom to use the data through any of the sources, either the preview, your TOMS data files, or SIRS data files to share locally for planning purposes, including you can share these at public meetings with your school board, for instance, or if you had a site that wanted to use it as part of their site council meetings, that's fine. You just can't share other people's data, and you can't share the entire county data for comparison purposes. You can't do that until the public release, and then it's fair game. Everything's fair game. Notably, in this message that went out, they said, to the extent possible, our intent remains to also release finalized California school dashboard data to allow for more holistic review as soon as possible, and not to be, the voice of pessimism here, but I don't think that's going to happen because for a couple of reasons. Number one, December was typically the month when we would see the dashboard anyway. It takes a while. They get that data from CAASPP, and they get that data from CalPADS, and it takes a while to crunch all the numbers, apply all the business rules, the accountability unit. And they had a CalPADS end of year submission that was delayed because of the issues that CalPADS encountered this year. So I really find it very unlikely. I think it's very unlikely that they'll get preliminary dashboard data up at the same time as this CAASPP LPAC preview. I think that when they talked about mid-December, even there was some head scratching by the people in the accountability unit because they know how much goes into it. That said, they're calculating one less indicator. So the college and career indicator isn't on this year's dashboard, so that may save them some time because that one's a beast, as many of you who've been around for a while know. So the college and career indicator won't be reported until 2023. And of the 5 indicators, state indicators that will be posted, they're only looking at status. So there are still business rules regarding, which students are eligible for being included, the application of the lowest obtainable scale score for CAASPP, all these things that get factored in. So it's not an easy task, and they want it to be clean. But you will get a preview of the dashboard when it is set to come out, and we will keep you apprised. I know this went out, but I would not be telling anybody, oh yeah, look for the dashboard in October. I think that's highly unlikely. But I wanted to give some updates too from the state board. So these are some really critical pieces of information that came through the state board last week. So first of all, the state board approved the criteria for identifying eligibility for differentiated assistance. And for this year, 2022, only school districts are going to be identified. The charter schools would not be eligible for differentiated assistance identification because the way DA is written up in state ed code until 2023. So charter schools, you're off the hook for DA for this year. But for school districts, they will be using the lowest status level. So we talked about this in the previous meetings, but this year they won't be reporting change, only status. And they'll use the lowest status level as a proxy for RED to determine the eligibility criteria for districts. So they'll use very low for academic indicator, graduation rate, and English learner progress. And they will use the very high status for chronic absenteeism and suspension, because of course we want those two, chronic absenteeism and suspension, to be low, not high. So those will be the criteria. And of course it's by student group. So if a student group qualifies for 2 of these criteria, an academic indicator is math and ELA combined, and it will be, and I'll switch this slide. So the criteria broken up by achievement area, or priority area, I should say, would be a very low on both ELA and math. So this is a slight difference from years past. And the data, when they looked at it, that while the very high and very low status is fairly predictable and reliable data, they found that once you moved away from that into the low or just the high status, it's not as reliable. So they determined this year that only very low, you'd have to be very low in both ELA and math to be identified for the academic indicator, very low on the English language progress indicator, very low on grad rate, very high on chronic absenteeism, or very high on suspension rate. And then in terms, I think you hopefully have seen this already, but what will the dashboard look like with status only? We're used to all this colors to choose from. And so they're looking for visual communication that would help keep things clear. So they went for the old cell phone bar and for status level. So pretty reliable. They're only going to use one color. Purple is the only color. As you can see on the right, what they'll be presenting, and we've seen this before. This is called the baseball card. So this is what will appear for each of the indicators is a baseball card with your status and the bars indicated for which each of these is for your district as a whole. If you have smaller groups, they will report out. You recall you have to have 30 students in most student groups to get an indicator, 15 for foster youth and homeless at the district level. If you don't have sufficient students, if it's below that number but above 11, you won't get a status, but it will show on the dashboard. You'll see what the actual calculation was. So if you had too few students, for instance, to get I can't think of one that would probably be unlikely to reserve, but if you had a very small population of English learners, for instance, maybe you would see what the calculation was for the ELPI, but you wouldn't have a status if you didn't have sufficient to reach that critical mass. You're a very small district, very few. There's a couple other updates that were interesting. So there are 2 links that are going to be added to the dashboard. And so any of you who are entering data, I've got a lot of emails this week about the local indicators, and I hope you got them all in. I haven't had a chance to look at the final list. I know there are a lot of LEAs who still had not submitted their local indicators by Friday. I haven't heard any updates if they were going to extend it for any reason, but a lot of questions came in related to local indicator priority 1, which is going to include a link to the teacher assignment monitoring outcomes data quest reports. And this was an issue from last spring when we expected this data to be auto-populated in this indicator. The report came out on June 30th. So pretty much everyone had already taken their local indicators alongside their LCAPs and put in front of the board. So people used their local data as they had collected it, and that is fine. If you reported your local data, that's the best you could do. This link will take folks to the dashboard or to the DataQuest teacher assignment monitoring reports. And I just will say, I tried the best I could to make sense to try to connect the two, and they don't make sense. And then we've talked to the accountability unit. There will be a lot more work in the upcoming year to try to make it more clear how misassignments of English learners and vacancies align with the teacher assignment monitoring outcomes. Just except for this year, it just is the federal definitions don't meet our state definitions, so there needs to be some cleanup there. Also linked on the website or on the dashboard will be a link to the California Science Test, which is great information. And I think that a lot of science teachers were advocating for this because we want to make science testing a priority, but it would have to get approved by the Department of Education for full inclusion on the dashboard, because there needs to be a balance of indicators, both academic and non-academic indicators. So as of right now, the best they can do is include a link, and it'll appear most likely under the more information link that you can see at the bottom of this page on the dashboard. But they wanted, the state board indicated they wanted to be featured prominently. And there'll be information about the availability of these links in the dashboard communications toolkit, as well as some discussion in a webinar series the CDE is going to be holding. Also, this was a response from the state board. So there's been kind of a back and forth between the state and the Department of Education regarding the status of dashboard alternative school status of the DAAS schools. And so if your LEA is a DAAS school or has a DAAS school, this will be of interest to you. So The state board had adopted a couple different modified measures for DOS schools because these are schools that typically have a rather high mobility rate. These are your alternative schools, oftentimes your continuation schools. There are some schools that are being included based on ed code. Any of the county office schools, the students who are adjudicated are included in these. So we have a vested interest, county offices do, in DAS schools. And we're looking to provide some measures that really accurately reflect the nature of these students. So there was a modified graduation rate, a one-year graduation rate being used, and there was a modified academic indicators with different PET scores. The Department of Ed decided that they had some concerns over it. They went back and forth, and ultimately in July, the Department of Ed declined to approve a waiver that the CDE had submitted, asking that the DOS measures be included. So with very little time remaining, these are the alternatives that they've came up with. So the state board approved to continue to report these DOS modified methods and non-modified methods on the dashboard. So it's in state ed code that we are able to report alternative measures. So those will continue to be reported. It just won't be counted towards for federal identification purposes. So there's probably going to be a lot more DOS schools identified for CSI based on low grad rate, because the feds are saying you can't use the one-year grad rate. They have to use the four-year grad rate for those schools. Also approved would be that any DOS school that is identified as eligible for CSI low grad will not be identified as a CSI school. Rather, they will identify it as a community of practice, just to kind of acknowledge the fact that DOS schools are dealing with a very different student population, oftentimes who are showing up very credit deficient, and to try to enable some like communication internally between these schools and the county offices who support them. I see a couple questions, so before I move on to the rest, maybe I'll.
Yeah, Evelyn, we have some questions with regards to priority one and the link that's going to be added versus what's going to be populated. And
So,
if
okay, yeah, so they're going to have both. So you'll have populated that the table asking for misassignments. That's a text box really, misassignments of English learners and vacancies, and then there will be text below with the link. The link won't replace it. They'll rest side by side. And the idea is that the link will help support this information. And there are just some groups that really wanted to see that teacher data. And there's actually state law. It's not just advocacy groups. There's state law that requires the state to include teacher assignment data on the dashboard. So by next year, it'll probably be more refined, and hopefully the guessing game as to what will be in there, and the disconnect will have been removed. But for the time being, it's just going to be both will be up there. And to the extent that you can, and if you look on our Canvas guide today, there are a number of recordings that the CDE has put up for teacher assignment monitoring. They've had ongoing office hours, which we've joined, which has been very helpful. Really, the best thing in viewing those is if you can get folks to understand your HR, your curriculum instruction, and accountability folks can get together, your CalPads staff, to remove some of the errors that may be showing up as misassignments or just as showing up in the unknown. But moving forward, there are going to be misassignments. It's just the reality of having a teacher shortage in the state. But to better understand what they represent, what the federal definitions are, may be helpful for you as a accountability person if you're asked questions by your board or members of the public about why there might be discrepancies in what you reported and what was reported in this TAMO data.
we had another question, Evan, from David about CSI status, and does it have any implications for DOS schools and CSI funding planning requirements?
For sure, the expectation is that more DOS schools will be identified both for grad rate and for low performing. And there is some conversation about changing as we move forward, not necessarily this year, the funding allocation. But yeah, so if you have a DOS school that is likely to get identified for CSI, look, I think the big consideration is it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to use some funding to improve what's being offered for those students and address some of their needs and do some planning around that. But yeah, there's going to be probably an increase this year in the number of DOS schools among the schools identified for CSI. I don't know if that fully answers your question, David. Yeah, and Walter, will schools continue to be identified as DOS schools? Yeah, so I think that the state is really adamant that we continue with the identification of schools as DOS schools, because there's a recognition that there are different needs within this group. And next couple of slides will address what the plans are moving forward. So I'm just going to keep going. Hopefully I can address that. Sarah, yes, the question if how you determine if a school is a DOS school. Actually, I'm going to have to answer that. I don't know if you haven't applied for it, and then you may not have a DOS school. But yeah, there's some statutorily defined DOS schools that I could share the statute. I'll put that in the follow-up. So some additional information. So the board also approved to develop differentiated improvement activities for those schools that predominantly serve students who are returning to education after exiting secondary school without a regular high school diploma. And this is often the students who we find, and I worked in adult ed and in continuation schools for a few years. So these are the students who show up, they're credit deficient. They may have alternative ways of graduating, and that was the advantage of the one-year graduation rate, that it captured students who took and completed and passed the CAASPP. It counted adult ed diplomas. It counted certificates of completion for students in DOS schools. It counted, there are a number of factors that had to be met, including some enrollment. They had to be enrolled for 90 consecutive days at a minimum. So this would, moving forward, provide a separate set of activities, and this maybe gets to your question, David, for DOS schools that are eligible for CSI. So to look for more guidance related to that, how that money might be spent. And would acknowledge the differences within schools, and that every school in support should not be treated the same. So there is some very specific guidance for CSI, what they needed to do in terms of creating a plan. That plan needed to be reflected in the LCAP, but DOS schools are different. And so there's a look that they have some flexibility around what guidance they could give for how that CSI money could be spent. Finally, as relates to the board, and this may get to your question, Walter, for 2023 and beyond, the CD is proposing some flexibilities offered under ESSA. So they didn't have a lot of time based on that July denial of their waiver request, but they are looking to some states already do, is using multi-year extended year grad rates for graduation rate indicators. So like 6- and 7-year graduation rates. So you can capture students who are well beyond their cohort, but still manage to complete a diploma. So several states already do that. And this would actually be applied to both the DAS and the non-DAS schools. Then they would consider, instead of just taking the top 5%, categorizing schools and looking at identifying the lowest performing Title I schools. This is the requirement of ESSA. You have to identify at a minimum 5%, but if they distributed them across categories, so elementary, middle, high, and then alternative schools, the word DAS school, and then 5% from each of those categories, then it would overly identify DAS schools. And then they're going to look at to explore excluding students from state indicators if they have not attended the same school for within a local education agency for at least half a school year. So, you know, the kind of addressing the mobility and how that can really affect that. And then different funding allocations. So this would be 23 and beyond. So how they might change that funding formula. But I thought it'd be a good time also to revisit the eligibility for assistance for comprehensive support and improvement and ATSI, because they do get kind of confused. Like you've got your state identification for differentiated assistance, then you have CSI and ATSI, which is a federal requirement. And it may have kind of slid under the radar. We talked about it a little bit, but the way that this year, this was actually a board item in March. And what the Department of Ed allowed was for states to submit a 1-year addendum that modified the way they would identify schools. And that's what got approved. And we did talk about this back in April, I think, but just a reminder. So you may be looking at your data now and starting to think, oh, do we have any likely candidates for CSI or ATSI? And you would be looking at just the 5 local indicators. Hopefully you got them in so you could report met. But if you didn't, they would be not met, but not met for just 1 year. I think the criteria would be not met for 2 years. So I don't know that that would help. And then they would be the 5 state measures that we talked about earlier would be where you would determine. And so for CSI, they first remove all the schools that qualify based on a low graduation rate. And then they identify among the Title I schools for CSI low performing, they look at the following 4 criteria. Schools that have all very low for their status. Then next, and this is hierarchical, so this next is schools with all very low, but 1 indicator of another status. So you could have even a high mixed in there, but if you had 4 out of the 5 were very low, then that would be the next criteria. Then schools with 5 or more indicators where the majority are very low. And then finally, schools with all very low and low status. And so those are for your CSI, and they only have to identify, they put a cap on the number of schools identified for CSI. They have to at least reach 5%. We talked about this. They'll apply each of these criteria until they reach that number, and then they don't have to identify anymore. So they don't have to apply all these criteria. So they couldn't know for sure, but they expected, I think, to get as far as the second criteria, and then have sufficient number of Title I schools for fulfilling their requirements under ESSA, and then they would identify no more. So that's the AT or the CSI. Then for ATSI, and the reason ATSI, you don't get money for ATSI. You do have to address it in your school. You have to have a plan that's addressed in your SIPSA, and it does require needs assessment. And CSI and ATSI schools are both added to the Williams list. So if they revise the Williams list based on CSI, ATSI, a school identified for ATSI could be added to the Williams list, which would add another requirement for that school to monitor their textbook supplies, teachers, and facilities for Williams. So for ATSI, the same criteria are used, but they're used at so this is for chronically underperforming student groups. They look at the race, ethnicity, all the groups. So, Black or African American, Hispanic, Latino, white, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American, or Alaska Native, all those student groups, if they have significant numbers, would be considered. Then also homeless students, English learners, foster youth, and students with disabilities, and then socioeconomically disadvantaged students. So all those individual student groups are what are considered. So if you have individual student groups identified based on those criteria, and there is no limitation, there's no cap put on ATSI. So potentially, they just captures all the schools that meet those criteria. So if you're interested and you're thinking, well, boy, chronic absenteeism, that's a problem for everybody this year. So you might have student groups identified for that. Yeah, suspensions were high, and then you start looking at your numbers for the academic indicators. You might have a clue that a school might be identified based on a student group. So if that didn't panic you, I think it's important to know that there is somewhat unique this year. In the past, the dashboard has been released, and then there's been a flurry of information shared. The CDE has been much more proactive this year, and so they've created this dashboard toolkit, and it's linked here. They have a communications toolkit. They're going to have webinars, and really, it's a good time to start thinking about what your message may be, because it's been a tough couple of years. A lot of schools will be identified, for instance, for chronic absenteeism as a problem for everybody, and it's going to be important that you can start thinking about the messages you want to share to tell your story about the data. Why is chronic absenteeism a problem for everybody? Well, we had mandatory quarantines, for example, and we had any number of kids who are actually sick because of COVID. So, chronic absenteeism is going to be, we know that that's a problem for everybody, but, some of the other areas, this will be the first time that the schools will be assigned the lowest obtainable scale score for not meeting participation rate, and that may have a significant impact, particularly if you have a smaller student group. So understanding that data may not reflect the performance of the students who did test, and communicating that as well, and being able to point parents or other educational stakeholders to where the information about how those students performed who did test is, and then just noting it's a penalty. And it's a federal penalty, doesn't indicate that we are necessarily failing in our work. Chris would love to get a refresher. Well, that's a great, thank you for sharing that. We will look into our child welfare and attendance unit. Maybe we can co-present with them on something. We, on the other hand, thought, boy, there's an awful lot of new faces. Maybe it's time to revisit the whole Accountability 101. So we are having a webinar on the 27th from 3 to 4:30. We will record it if you can't join us. But it's an introduction to accountability in the California School Dashboard. So if you're new to this role, or even if you just want a refresher, we're going to dive in. We don't have a lot of time to do it in DAAN, but just looking at some of the foundational principles of the dashboard, understanding the state and local indicators and how they're shaped by the 8 state priority areas. Then we'll look at the criteria in greater depth for differentiated assistance, CSI, ATSI. And then we'll talk about the deep dive around the dashboard business rules, including the loss, the District of Special Education Accountability. These are all kind of these nuanced things that come out in the dashboard technical guide, which will be coming out, but probably not until the dashboard is released. But these are things that may get you, hung up if you didn't understand them or you didn't see them coming. So we're trying to answer your questions in greater detail there. And also talk about messaging and something. Messaging, how's my messaging when I get mid-thought and I forget to finish it? So but talk about how you may message that. And there's a link in there. That is our link to register for this special webinar. So this is specific to topic. So that's it for my section, but let's go through the questions. Hillary.
Now I'm dropping some links in here.
I believe the typo on the date. Is that intended to be October?
Yes, that is. Yeah, September 27th would be hard to meet. October 27th, thank you. See, it's one of those things where you just can't accept that October is already here. So it's, a state of denial.
And I'm going to drop the link right now for everyone. Yep.
All right. I'm going to, with that, I'm going to hand the show back over to Stephen and Stephanie.
Perfect. Okay, great. So with that, we'll go ahead and go into some assessment updates. Again, my name is Stephanie Fortunato. My colleague here, Stephen Bartlett. And so we've got, as we were mentioning earlier, in the ever-changing world of assessment, some of the most recent updates. So we'll go ahead and talk about some updates as it relates to the State Board of Education meeting, which occurred last month. We'll talk about some updates with our regional assessment network, specifically as it relates to both CAASPP and ELPAC, and hopefully we'll have a small window of time available to do some networking with one another, and then we'll end with sharing out some professional learning opportunities. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephen, who will get us started with some State Board of Education updates.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, we'll start with updates from item 4 from this last State Board of Education meeting, September 14th, 2022. So almost a month ago now. The State Board of Education approved the use of Smarter Balance adjusted form blueprints. Those are the shorter blueprints just for the computer adapted component. And those are those 50% shorter adjusted form blueprints. And you may recall that the consequence of that is to not allow a student level detailed data for small groups, so claim results continue to be unavailable on the individual student level, but they're going to be available at the groups of greater than 30 on the test results for California Assessment's website. They're working, of course, with other states, Smarter Balances, on the development of composite claim reporting. That would be the alternative to the claim results that we have been familiar with so far. For the adjusted form blueprints, that would be continuing with the shorter form, but getting detailed data. That process is ongoing and is not completed yet. The adjusted form blueprints, of course, only apply to the Smarter Balance summative assessments for ALA and math. The interim comprehensive assessment continues to be based on the full form blueprints, and so that's an alternative. Also, the performance tests are the full form. PFT updates for PFT. PFT coordinator needs to be designated by November 1st, coming up next month. 22-23 PFT shall be administered in accordance with the changes implemented in the 21-22 school year. So it's going to be the same procedure as last year. No additional PFT changes are going to be added for this current school year. Further details regarding the SBE meeting, item 4, are available on the SBE's website. Coming up in November 2022, there's going to be CD recommendations for addendums to the high-level design for the California Spanish assessment, including proposed revised blueprint for that, revised score reporting structure, and the adoption of the final statement of reasons and the proposed amendments to the regulations for the PFT. But as stated in September, that will not adjust the 22-23 administration. We look at regional assessment network updates. We'll go through some of those. So those are based on a September 21st meeting of the Regional Assessment Network that actually got to meet in person. So it's exciting to see here and there meetings happening again in person. There is, I believe we have ETS on the line at the end of the meeting. And so here's a reminder of how to access them. The website's CAASPP.org, ELPAC.org. Contact through Caltech agents at the phone number. The link goes to it, and the front page, of course, has got this image of the person with the headset that you can find all those links at. Our success agent is the Region 11 success agent. I believe it's a team now, and that LAUSD, Long Beach, and the rest of Region 11 are all consolidated into a single team of 3 or 4 individuals. If we look at this page, there's a page that takes you to all of the CAASPP and ELPAC manuals. They've been updated here for the 22-23 school year. Good thing to bookmark. It looks like this, and great source for checking all those out. In terms of calendars, ELPAC state level training first. We'll look at ELPAC, then CAASPP, and then joint trainings. ELPAC state level, we've got a summative ELPAC AST question and answer session that's coming up. That is October 25th, and in October 27th, there's a new coordinator training webinar number 3. I believe that's both ELPAC and CAASPP. If I'm correct. In November, the results are in Now What become available. Those are available currently. Modules, I believe 1 through 10 are available on Moodle, and then those will become available, modules 11 through 14 in early November in Moodle as well. So self-study available with the results are in series on Moodle. SIRS tools, SIRS for teachers, Moodle's keys are going to be available on the ST website November 1st. That would be for summative ELPAC. And then November 15th, we've got 2 different items: boosting instruction with formative assessment and accessibility strategies trainings, and LEA ELPAC coordinators and lead trainers are going to need to answer test administration questions for the summative alternate ELPAC. Then November 17th, we have a pre-test virtual training series. These are all state level trainings that are available through elpac.org, and that link through to the trainings, upcoming trainings website. CAASPP ETS trainings have upcoming on October 4th through 12th interim and formative assessment training series. And November 15th, formative assessment accessibility strategies training, and then November 17th, a pre-test virtual training series. If we look at one of the updates, probably previewed in this calendar of of trainings, and you'll see it listed in the next LPAC and CAASPP combined trainings, because LPAC and CAASPP both use the ISAP tool, and you've got an ISAP profile user guide is updated for 22-23 administration, so that's newly available. Combined ETS trainings, of course, ongoing are coffee sessions. I'm sure California Outreach will talk about those. And October 12th, data-driven decision-making training. I believe some of the individuals in your DAAN leadership are part of that training. SIRS training for teachers, I believe Stephanie may be part of that training. California Assessment Conference is coming up on 18th through 20th. Several of your DAAN presenters here are presenting at that DAAN conference, at that California Assessment Conference. October 26th, additional SIRS and data-driven decision-making trainings, new coordinator training webinar that was listed on LPAC is also coming up on the 27th. SIRS training for teachers, November 1st, and formative assessment on the 15th, and a pre-test virtual training series, sort of a newer training series coming up on the 17th. So looking towards LPAC individually, we'll look at some of those updates. There's a CVEDS reminder. So I'll just read this. For newly enrolled students to be included in the 22-23 unduplicated pupil count used to determine funding for the supplemental and concentration grants under the local control funding formula, students must complete the entire initial LPAC, all 4 domains, or the initial alternate LPAC on or before Census Day, which is October 5th. So they're telling us that in order to get in that 1.17 report, a student has to have completed initial LPAC or initial alternate LPAC before Census Day. So maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that was a deadline plus 30 days, plus maybe a week to get in the system. Maybe 2 years ago, there was guidance that said, make sure you've tested 2 or 3 days prior to Census Day so that data transfers from TOMS into CalPads in time, that data being the EL or IFEP status of the student. Current guidance is apparently prior to Census Day, so I guess the Tuesday prior would be October 4th, which is today, so too late. Upcoming dates. In general, for LPAC, we've got the 1% threshold survey. I think we have a separate slide for that. Summative LPAC form assignments happen on the 15th of October. So mid-month, you'll know if you're Form 1 or Form 2 for each of your schools, or multiple different ones for your district. Most districts are on a single form unless you're very large. October 17th, you'll have an opening of the summative LPAC administration and scoring training. That's in Moodle, and that was mentioned previously. And then November 1st, the ordering window for the summative alternate, for the paper versions, which is infrequently used currently. There's alternate LPAC reclassification interim guidance. So alternate LPAC or reclassification guidance is something you want to reach out, or have your EL department reach out to the MOS unit to get a full breadth and understanding to. But there's standardized criterion 1 of the 4 criteria, and that standardized criterion 1 officially indicates that a level 4 is sufficient for reclassifying according to criteria 1, and then of course those other 3 criteria are also required. And now with the advent of the alternate LPAC, there is a high score on the alternate LPAC of level 3, so that level 4 guidance doesn't work. So that has not been passed yet. But there is interim guidance for that reclassification saying that level 3 is sufficient for alternate. If we look at some additional information about initial LPAC, there's some guidance that's coming out about students having no tests available, and ensuring that you're working with your CalPads coordinator and ensuring that there's time to process between information entered in CalPads and that transfer into TOMS. Of course, you may be the CalPACS coordinator if you're Dan, or you may be overseeing the CalPACS coordinator. Very important to ensure that the data is in there in a way that that can be accessed by Tom. So that means no overlapping enrollments, TBD with a valid date, and all the elements required for Tom's use. This is a repeat from last Dan, but it's been repeated by the state, so we'll repeat it here. 30 calendar days for a TBD takes priority over a future expectation that a student will become eligible for the alternate initial LPAC. So students should be tested within 30 days of enrollment as a priority over testing with what might end up being the right test. So initial LPAC first, if that designation has not yet gone through for the initial alternate LPAC. And then of course, that all for one or alt for one, alt for all guidance doesn't apply to that initial LPAC. It's just applying to the alternate LPAC summative and the alternate California alternate assessments. This was talked about during the prior slide on the dates. Modules 1 through 10 are available in Moodle. In the early November, you're going to have them arrive. The rest of them also be uploaded in Moodle for self-study. One of the DAAN updates include one of the regional area network updates included a warning that small LEAs or new LEAs had not designated LPAC coordinators. So very important if you are a small or new LEA or a small charter to ensure that your superintendent, as named in the California School Directory, has updated that information. CAASPP updates. Oops.
And Steve, I'm gonna pause just right there. There are just a couple of LPAC questions, and so before
Please.
maybe we go on to.
Okay, let's look at what we got.
So
what would you say is the first one? Geb Fisher's?
yeah, Jeb had asked about,
Jeb.
does LPAC ordering include the writing workbooks for lower primary grades?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Yeah. Summative LPAC writing for grade 1 and 2, K through 2, would also be ordered. Thank you. Thank you, Jeb.
And then Claudia had asked, and I think this was referenced to a couple slides earlier that you had on the CBEDS one, about how can you complete the test for newly enrolled students when it takes 2 days for the student to show in the testing system?
How can you complete the test for newly enrolled students when it takes 2 days for the student to show in the testing student? So I'm imagining you're saying student enrolls on October 3rd. You want to test before October 5th, and you won't be able to test because they're not in Tom's yet. That's very true. You know, several years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, the guidance indicated that the students who had tested and had been recorded with a EL status or an IFEP status, that status would go forward into the 1.17 up to 45 days after CBEDS Day, after Census Day, accounting for new enrollees. That guidance changed, I believe, about 2 years ago. Maybe there's some internal structure that that accounts for that, but I would make sure that the student, if they were identified by one of the other means, if they were identified by on 1.17 under the unduplicated pupil percent, or one of the other areas like a free and reduced price lunch or foster homeless, that was documented within the system prior to Fall 1 certification, so that if they're identified in one way, it doesn't affect their overall eligibility, because unduplicated would mean they'd only be counted once. So if they're documented via one of the other methods, that would give them documentation of counting. But in terms of this guidance on TOMS and ELAS status, this has been repeated over the last 2 or 3 years that census day is the deadline.
Okay.
Is there another question you see?
Not in related to LPAC. There's just some other questions, but we can address as we go along.
Okay. Okay, so I believe I'm doing this as well, and then I'm gonna drop this off to you in a couple slides. So we have updates to student score reports. SBE, State Board of Education, in September, there was approval of some update to the student score reports. That's a return of language that compares student performance to previous year, and that's only on Smarter Balance SSRs. And there's some other updates. Korean's added as language available for printing for your students. School and state averages are remain suppressed on CAASPP SSRs, and individual claim results for SBAC are not available still, as we mentioned earlier. In terms of the California science test results, data available on the test results for California Assessment's website, CAS student score reports available in TOMS, and all on the same timeline with ELA and math this year. I believe there is a California alternate for science guidance that's separate from the CAS guidance. I believe Stephanie's going to go over that in a few minutes. There's a new feature for high school for reporting high school CAST results. So you can compare high school test results by individual grade levels, grade 10, 11, or 12. You can view CAST results for all of your high school students who test in a single year. For example, the high school class of a particular year or cohort year, such as the year 2022. This allows you to look at CAST scores for all your students who make up grade 12 and 22, regardless of whether they tested in grades 10, 11, or 12. And there's going to be a change in time feature for the CAST as well implemented. All right, I think that's, let me wait. No, this is me. I'm the next slide, and then I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie. So designated supports in English learners. So students in grades 8 and high school using stacked Spanish translations will also be able to access a Spanish version of the periodic table through the test delivery system. In addition, CDE's edited the high school reference sheet, and printable versions of this reference sheet are now available. It says in their announcement on the CAASPP webpage. I was unable to find them on the CAASPP webpage, but they indicate that those are available through the test delivery student system for students who use stacked translations. So previously a gap for that designated support for the California science test. All right, Stephanie.
All right, great. Thank you. So we'll go ahead and start by taking a look at some updates for the California alternate assessment for science. So on the next slide, you'll see there's already been the data preview that you have more than likely been looking at. There is still one that is coming up for CAA for science. You'll notice that the LEA preview of the aggregate results will be November 14th through the 18th. So keep a lookout for that. But with that being said, you'll notice on the next slide that the CAA for science opened on September 6th. So that has already started. There's a really nice visual here. There's a link to, how that assessment is organized. Students will be taking 4 separate embedded performance tasks, and each one will contain about, 10 different test questions that'll be specific to one of the 3 different science domains. It's important to note that LEAs will receive 1 form number for all of the CAA for science materials. So you'll be able to find some more information at that link as well. And you'll find, just as a reminder again on the next slide that, any test examiners who are going to be administering the CAA for science must first complete the test examiner tutorial. Again, this is found in Moodle. And so it's just really important, you know, the test examiners will wind up receiving a certificate that says that they've actually completed the requirements. So please make sure that before they're receiving that test examiner role in TOMS, that they have submitted to you a copy of that certificate and they've completed that training. So that is available in Moodle. And, you know, it's important to note, you know, we want to make sure that the window's open, right? So that we're not waiting until necessarily April or May for students to take those 4 embedded performance tasks. We want them to take them throughout the entire school year so that they have the opportunity to really demonstrate their learning. So it opens September 6th for exactly that reason, right? We want to make sure that the teachers are teaching the content. The test examiner then is administering that specific embedded performance task throughout the year. So testing may wind up occurring, maybe one performance task might be in October, another one might be in December, February, and so on. It's really aligned to when that instruction is occurring. So new this year, though, you'll see that beginning this year, they now have what is called the preparing for administration. So we have what's called the PFA. You'll see that on the next slide. And this is really what's used to prepare for administration. So the information that was formerly called the DFA, the directions for administration, now really contains information that's used at the time that the test is being administered. So now we have PFA and then DFA. So just some updates there for the CAA for science. And we'll go ahead now and transition to talking about what's new for interim assessments and tools for teachers, and also SIRS this year. So new this year, you'll see on the next slide with 22-23, there's more than 200 interim assessments that are now available. There's been some additions of a few new focused IABs. They've also updated some of the performance tasks for some of the grade levels in ELA and math. So I know that they're really listening to educators about, you know, changing some of those things out. But, you know, it's important to note that, you know, staff needs to access it through Tom's account. So making sure that your teachers have either a role that is, you know, IA, meaning that they can administer interim assessments only, or maybe they have that TA role, right? They're going to be administering interim assessments and summatives later this year. So, but making sure that those interims, you know, that they're not using them for high stakes decisions, right? They're used formatively throughout the year to really, you know, gain a better understanding of where students lie instructionally and the different types of supports that they need. What's new and exciting that is potentially coming, we're hoping, starting the next school year, are science interim assessments. So there's been mention, you'll see on the next slide, that these are set to be released in the 23-24 school year, and then the second round of them in the 24-25 school year. So we're getting close. They're not quite there yet, but that's on the horizon in case you have any teachers who are asking about that. The continuation for tools for teachers is still there. You'll see that there are, you know, 150 new ELA and math resources that are there. There's an additional 10 science resources. I know they're continuing to add in tools for teachers for science, but they've also put together a really nice, you know, 4-module set there on really, you know, building effective school-home partnerships. So you'll find those in tools for teachers. There's links there also that will take you directly to them, but, you know, building trust with families and how to share data with families, looking at different multiple measures and setting goals, and also navigating difficult conversations. So I saw earlier that there was some discussions in the chat about SIRS. And so SIRS, you may have seen, is a powerful tool. There was an email on the next slide that was sent just last month, so just a few weeks ago, about, you know, how to access SIRS assessment results, about how SIRS is really, you know, time saving and using those interim assessment results. You could switch to the next slide. And then also in 22-23 school year, you know,
Evan and Hillary.
What's that?
Are you able to take over the presentation? Mine's locked up. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Let me do that. Just a moment.
I can do it. Yeah, let me take over.
I think it's on slide 58. You want me to see if I could do it? Or okay. So I had dropped in the chat too that there is that SIRS for coordinators and administrators training coming up. It's on October 26th, so it's the next slide. If you haven't had a chance, I know that there's always a lot of questions about, setting up rosters and report groups and the data that's found in SIRS. So there is a training that's available specific for coordinators and administrators, but there is also one for teachers. And that one is coming up on October 13th. And it's just slightly different in that, looking at the data from a teacher perspective, talking about the instructional resources that are available, especially if you're an LEA that's going to be using those interim assessments this year, which we hope you are. It's really a great training to be able to attend to get some updates there. So, all right, so just a few additional updates that are still and they're coming out, we say like they're always coming out each week, but you may have seen this email about the deadline for 22-23 for setting up your test administration window. You'll notice there that that deadline is December 1st. I know it's been discussed at a recent coffee session, but you have a little bit of time there, but just making sure that you're setting that by December 1st. But if by some chance that there are changes that may need to be made, after the December 1st deadline, you would then contact your Region 11 success agent, to be able to make any adjustments there. And then also you may have seen an email that came out about the 1% threshold survey. That annual survey has been sent out. It's set to be completed by October 12th. So there's a link there on the slide that will take you directly to that communication and to some additional information about that. But please make sure that you are completing that survey as well. There are so many updates that are continuing to come out. So this is just kind of a way of, pointing you in the right direction of different types of ways to stay up to date. So, you've got those outreach emails, but also, CAASPP emails and LACOE emails. There's the assessment spotlight, and also always information about CDE workshops and trainings. And so with that, just wanted to transition to discussing assessment results. We know that you have all had a chance, hopefully, to take a look at some of your aggregate data results that are there and take a preview on the CDE site. I don't know that we necessarily had time. We were going to actually break into breakout rooms, but there's so much recent updates and such. We wanted to be able to give you some time to talk about this. And I don't know, do you think we should maybe put that for an agenda item at the top of next meeting for timing's sake?
Sounds good, Stephanie. Yeah,
I think so.
Okay. All right. So we'll leave those slides in there just to kind of get you thinking about, how is it that your district is using CAASPP results and LPAC results? Just kind of keeping that in your mind so that we can go ahead and share that out at an upcoming meeting. And with that, we will just go ahead and close out with some professional learning opportunities. We've mentioned some of these already. You will see there's information there about the California Assessment Conference. There's a link that will direct you to that registration. Also, we just were mentioning some professional learning opportunities that can be found on the CAASPP site. I'll go ahead and drop, I think there was a question about the SIRS for teachers training. You'll see it there listed, and we can go ahead and drop those links in there. But also, we're really excited here at LACOE to be able to offer some of our own professional learning opportunities coming up. So you'll see them listed October 11th, which is just next week. Stephen and I are going to be hosting professional learning on Unlocking Smarter's Toolbox. So we'll take a closer look at tools for teachers and the Connections playlist. We're going to be doing a training on accessibility for all students. That's going to be over 3 different sessions in November. And then also we're really excited to be able to have Jeff Zwiers join us. We're going to be talking about the power of using performance tasks, in this case specifically for ELA. So we're going to have 2 different sessions, one for elementary educators and one for secondary. And so you'll find that link there as well. And so I'll go ahead and pause for any Q&As. I see that there have been some comments, but also our contact information is included in the slide deck. You can certainly reach out to us whenever you need to. Are there any pending questions, or are they being answered?
I think we've been mostly answering them as they've come up.
Okay, great.
And yeah, we could give a pause for a minute And we do have our ETS success agent on the call with us or on the Zoom with us, so we can switch over to Marcus Betancourt here in just a second. But if you have any other questions, or maybe you want to hold off to go right to the source. All right. Marcus, you have co-host capacity, so you can go ahead and share a screen if you want to bring up your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Evan. Hello and good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing?
We're great, Marcus.
Perfect. Good. Okay, so just a couple things. Again, Stephanie and Stephen, excellent excellent information. I couldn't have said it better myself. When it comes to you, LACOE and everybody else there, you guys are really on top of your stuff, and you guys have been utilizing the resources a lot from our site. So we appreciate that, and keep on using those resources. So just as a reminder, all of the resources can be found both on CAASPP.org and ELPAC.org. I know most of the LEAs are in the more brunt of the given the initial LPAC. So, but if you have any CAASPP questions as well as we approach summative in the spring, please don't hesitate. We're there for you. Then also my contacts are listed at the bottom. So the best way to reach me always, as some of you have learned, is through email. I do assist a lot of the LEAs within the region, so emails are answered pretty quickly, and with these information as well. I'm on phones as well, and then also after you've bypassed the chatbot feature, Anita, I can be reached directly on chat as well if you need more direct assistance. I believe this was shared already, but please, just as a reminder, bookmark that for any CAASPP or LPAC manuals that you may require. I'll also be answering, I was looking through the chat earlier in the other presentations, I'll be answering a couple direct ones as well, and giving links and resources to those people.
Marcus, I don't think we're not seeing, we're seeing your static slideshow. We're not seeing.
Oh, okay, hold on. Sorry, let me try that again. Is that better?
Now we're back to we're seeing your PowerPoint, but not just the first slide. So maybe you could just scroll through that. Maybe if that will work.
Yeah, are they moving now for you?
Yeah, now they're moving.
Okay, perfect. So we'll start at 4 here. So this is what I'm experiencing a lot in the field currently right now with working with LEAs. A lot of you may have come across this particular issue, is specifically when you're giving the initial LPAC, a lot of the time there's a student has no test available message that you're receiving. The main part of this, what I've been noticing, is a lot of that CalPads information. I did see a lot of questions regarding the CalPads and SIS, a couple of questions I answered directly in the chat. So a lot of the times what I'm noticing is that LEAs are relying on their SIS systems as far as transferring that information to CalPads directly. It does, I don't want to say delay, but it does take some time from the SIS system to CalPads and then to TOMS. So just be aware that there is a bit of a delay as far as information transferring from one system to another and then to another system. Typically, the way that works is if CalPads is updated and that file is then given to the TOMS team or is uploaded by the LEA, typically that takes about 24 hours to make it into the TOMS system itself, and then an additional 24 hours to the actual test delivery system. So just because the student is in TOMS, they are assigned a test, and then they have all the correct demographic information. Even though that green check mark that you see a lot of the time for the test being assigned, that doesn't necessarily indicate the student being able to test directly. It just means they've been assigned a test, but it doesn't necessarily indicate that the student demographic information itself has fully integrated into the test delivery system. So that does take a bit of time. As long as you have your CalPads up to date as soon as possible, usually that's when that timeline starts going, the 24 hours to TOMS, and then the additional 24 hours to the test delivery system. And then just be aware as well, there are some LEAs that have actually been selected for the RSVP, which is the rotating score validation process for return of materials. One big question I've been getting a lot of is the pre-ID labels. So if you are an RSVP that is or an LEA that is part of the RSVP, pre-ID labels do not need to be ordered, as they have done in the past at times, that they don't need to be ordered, well, like with the summative. What will happen is once a student completes the initial LPAC and all of the domains plus the DEIs have been completed, what's going to happen is they're actually going to be put and processed automatically once that student generates a student score report. So you won't have to worry about ordering that. It's just as long as that student has a student score report and that's appearing as downloadable, what's going to happen is their pre-ID labels are automatically going to be generated, and then they will be sent in a shipment to the LEA. Any questions so far? I'm looking through the chat right now, but I don't see anything presently.
No questions so far.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so the next thing we'll get into, so this is another one that I've come across a lot in the beginning of the administration years. Further down the road, as we get into the summative window for CAASPP and when those windows start opening up in spring, any user, whether the LEA adds that user or the site coordinator adds those users, just make sure that they are completing their security forms within a timely manner, if possible. I understand some teachers are teaching when they receive those emails and when they're added. We just want to make sure that they're signing those forms and submitting them, because what's going to happen is if they don't sign those, when they actually access the TA interface, they're only going to be presented with the interim assessments, regardless of their CAASPP or LPAC role, because that form hasn't been signed yet. So when they access the TA interface, I can't tell you the amount of correspondences I've received, and we just don't want to cause any unnecessary panic for those users that are trying to administer. So after the forms are signed, it's going to take about 30 to 60 minutes after those forms have been completed in order for the correct test selections based on the role they've been given to actually appear in the TA interface. So it's not an instantaneous process, but it takes about 30 to 60 minutes, anywhere around that range, for our TOMs to recognize that the forms have been assigned, and then from them to be granted the correct test selections in the TA interface. This one pertains specifically to the initial LPAC. This is for the test examiners. Now, please be aware that grades 3 through 12, they do require hand scoring to be done in the teacher hand scoring system. So even if the student has all of the domains and the DEIs completed for grades 3 through 12, what's going to happen is if a score is not generating for that student, you'd want to double check the teacher hand scoring system just to make sure that whoever actually launched that administration has completed the scoring, and then also they have marked as complete in the teacher hand scoring system. What will happen is after they submit that, it usually takes about I think about 30 minutes or so after that's been completed for the scores to populate. So it takes about 30 minutes for, after marking as complete, for those responses for them to populate as far as the SSR itself. So again, if you're not seeing a student score report, definitely check the teacher hand scoring system first as well, just to ensure that there's not any responses that have not been graded or been scored at that point. We've also included some links as well on how to score the items in the teacher hand scoring system as well. Feel free to bookmark those links as well. And then please note, if a student did not provide a written response in the writing prompt itself, the item will not show up on the response list. So it won't show up on the response list, thus it won't need to be hand scored at that point if they don't have anything in the written response there. So this is another one that I've come across with the teacher hand scoring specifically, and this would account for both the interim assessments and the initial LPAC that's going on currently. So if at any point, if the screen appears blank when trying to access that teacher hand scoring system, we'd like to make sure that they're clearing all the cache cookies and history, specifically for the Google Chrome, since that's what I've noticed is the most widely used web browser. Just make sure you're clearing history for all time. Because what happens is if enough data has built up in that actual browser, it will impede viewability to the teacher hand scoring system, and that will still that screen will still appear blank as well. And then the second part is if that history has been cleared for all time, attempt the incognito window. I've actually had a lot of success with that as well, because the history is not being not recorded, but the history is not being cataloged basically, and opening that incognito window is going to allow them just to access the hand scoring system directly. This is another big one that I've noticed in the field currently, working with LEAs a lot of the time. And as you can see the screenshot listed there, that EL status, or the English language acquisition status, a lot of the time when they excuse me, when they upload the information from CalPads, for some reason, those two fields are blank. So if those two fields are blank, you'll actually show in the student profile that there's no test assigned. Those fields must populate TBD, or to be determined, and then they have to actually have the primary language, anything other than English, listed there, because TBD and the student's actual primary language based on the home language survey must be present in those fields in order to populate the test assignment and for the student to actually be able to log in as well. So. Okay, any questions? Answer some of these chats as well.
We've been trying to answer some of them
No
as they come
questions?
along.
Kinda
So
quiet,
yeah, I'm really
everybody.
trying to, I know it's really quiet. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Let's see. Well, I'm going to go backwards. There might be others. Marcus, from Sarah, any update on this? When we did the TOMS export of CAASPP data, we had over 220 kids who had the CAASPP BLA scores in all areas, but were missing all of the performance task, individual scores, organization conventions, etc.
Yes, Sarah, we're actually working on that currently right now. I actually just sent an update to my team. We did notice that some of the, I believe it has something to do with field test items, but I'm trying to currently obtain some more information regarding why those particular fields were blank within the student score data file. There's a little bit more than meets the eye than I first had anticipated. So I'm actually checking on that right now for you.
Thank you, Marcus.
Sure, no problem.
I'm still going backwards here. Olivia asked, at what point can we order ID labels?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the ID labels, is this for summative or for initial? I just want to preference that. Summative, okay. So as far as the summative pre-ID labels, let me go ahead and drop that in the, I'll stop sharing here. I'll go ahead and drop that for you, Olivia, in the chat here, the link directly for that. But I believe as far as pre-ID labels, the way that's going to work for summative is there's two initial dates that those are actually produced. I'll pull those up right now. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so as far as the summative labels, they're actually not ordered as well. They're actually pre-populated, kind of like the initials.
So those are pre-populated from CalPads, suggesting a need to ensure that CalPads data is.
Yeah, so
Burning
basically
possible.
the way that, correct, Stephen. The way that works is as long as, let me just double check to make sure I have this here. Yeah, we want to make sure that those students, I believe, as long as they have the EL designation, looks like the dates for this year is there's going to be 2 production dates for pre-ID labels, and I'll go ahead and include that in the chat as well. January 13th, 2023, and March 10th of 2023. I'm going to post that to Olivia right now. Then I did see some earlier questions I just wanted to address that I saw, I think, believe from Chris, and then Yeah, okay. So Yvette, I'm going to go ahead and address as well because she had a question. When Evan, you brought up a really good point as far as like what the LEA coordinators, something you had asked them what they had feared, and I saw a couple of those I wanted to kind of just put in there as well. So for Yvette, I know she had a question about stairs submission and CalPads itself. We're somewhat limited in our field with CalPads directly since we don't oversee that system, but I'm going to go ahead and include the stairs submissions link directly. That's a whole overview and a guide as far as how to submit stairs submissions. I know some of them in the past can be tricky, so you can definitely reach out to me if they require a little bit more nuanced care as opposed to just what's listed in the guidelines. And then I'm also going to include the CalPads help desk number for you if you had any questions regarding demographic information, anything like that.
Let's see, I might have seen one other one in there.
Sure.
Mario, and I don't know, maybe Stephen, sometimes I lose track. Mario had asked, non-RSVP LEAs don't return writing answer books, correct, since these are not scannable?
Correct. So those aren't going to be returned because they're not a part of the RSVP because they're input directly to the writing DEI. I believe there's going to be instructions sent via email on basically what LEAs would do is they're going to hold on to that, securely store it at the time, and then towards the end of the administration, there's going to be further information on how to send those back to ETS directly for secure destruction, or there's another process we have in place where we actually ask the LEAs to obtain documentation if they have like a third party securely destroyed those as well. Sure.
There's a question
Chris,
about oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. No, go ahead, Stephen.
I'm going to address a question about the 1% threshold survey requirements.
Sure.
So even if your district does not use alternate assessments, you're required to fill out the 1% threshold survey. That will go to CAASPP coordinators because it's based on CAASPP and not LPAC and not not CalPads. So there's full guidance on that survey, and I can share screen with well, there it is. There's a link to that guidance, www.cde TATG CA 1%. You can link that through the materials link in the Canvas page, or just Google 1% threshold survey California, and the first link will bring you to that page. It's a link to an online form, and you'll need to be working with your special ed coordinator. You should have a special ed coordinator designated as a contact for CAASPP as well, so that is aligned. The underlying guidance is guidance for IEP teams on deciding whether or not a student should be included in the students who take the alternate assessments, so that's that may need to be pushed out from you to special ed IEP teams or the special ed department to drive out to their IEPs, but that should underlie the students who have been chosen to take the alternate assessments. You're going to end up giving an estimate of the number of students who are expected to take the alternate assessment, and number who are expected to take the general assessment.
And just for a little more context, this is a federal requirement. This is part of ESSA, the limitation of 1% of the administration of alternative assessments. And it applies at the state level. So the state really needs to collect all the information then if they needed to submit a waiver of their own for exceeding that. So that's why you're being asked to do it. And it does tie in with ESSA requirements and keeps you in compliance with the federal. Keeps the state in compliance with the feds on this.
perfectly allowed to exceed the 1% threshold. There's no penalty or identification for anything for exceeding the 1% threshold. However, you might look into practices for identifying students if you're, at 5-10%, or look at the programs that your district offers. And if those programs are heavy on the alternate assessment groups, that might be appropriate, but something to consider.
Question from Karen. Some students didn't complete all 4 domains on the Summit of LPAC for 2022 and now have a score of a level 1. Are we to upload their scores to our system? I assume you mean your like data warehouse, like Illuminate or Aries Analytics. I was informed in prior years they were not to upload from the student score data file and write a note that the student didn't complete a certain domain. Is this still a practice?
That sounds like an appropriate practice to asterisk anything that is less than standard. I know even in LPAC 2022, districts were impacted by lower than normal testing rates, and districts were impacted by a larger than average number of students remote, and the remote testing was still a part of, well, it continues and will be an option, but it is was a more widely used option. Certainly document is an appropriate way to address anything that would suggest difference than what one would expect for an outcome.
Karen, if you could drop in the chat what system you use, I'm just curious to see, because oftentimes the data file would include a field that would show as incomplete, and usually you're pulling into a system that has a template for uploading that seemingly that would be captured. Okay, Q. Okay, thank you. I'll do a little more investigation. We work with Q for our CalPAS network. Any other questions? We've hit the 10:30 mark. And I know we thank Marcus for joining us. Always a font of knowledge.
You guys do. Honestly, you guys do a fantastic job of just taking the resources we have already, and it's amazing every time I look over, or when like this morning when I started, I was like, wow, they've taken all those resources and just running with them. So definitely thank your LACOE team, guys. They are incredible at just utilizing what's already in front of them. One thing before I go, I'm gonna go ahead, and because I know somebody, I'm not sure if she's still on, but I think it was Beth. She had a question in regards to not knowing deadlines, or having a fear of, when's this deadline, when's that deadline. I'm going to go ahead and drop both links for the CAASPP coordinator checklist. It's not just the LEA level, but it goes everything from all the way to the LEA to even the TA level. So there's a lot of really good information there that you can use as far as like, hey, what, I've already administered to this amount of students, or I've completed my window. What should I be doing next? Everything's listed there. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that right now for everybody, just to everybody, so they can have that as a resource. It's very, very helpful as far as providing a timeline on what can be done, even in advance.
Thanks, Marcus. And we'll add those links to our Canvas page.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions before we close for the day? We appreciate those of you who hung in there with us. We always appreciate your questions, and we will follow up with any of those that we didn't answer or weren't able to answer here. But and we'll get the recording of this up to our website just as soon as possible for your reference. But happy October. Don't be scared. Push forward. Stay calm, and assessment on, I guess, accountability on, I don't know. Anyway, well, thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time.